Is 1816. Imagine a beautiful old villa on Lake Geneva, the Villa Diodati. And there, living during the summer, is Lord Byron. He has fled from England. He will never return. He had a huge scandal with his wife. Basically, she accused him of committing incest with his half sister, Augusta, and Byron fled the country under the a cloud of scandal. So he is here, and coming to visit him are Percy Shelley, another poet, a friend of his, and the partner of Percy Shelley, Mary Godwin, the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who, of course, will soon write Frankenstein. She and Shelley are not yet married. They will be married in December of this year. And along with them is Mary Shelley's half sister, Claire Claremont, who also at this time is Byron's mistress. And these convene on Lake Geneva, hoping for an enjoyable summer. However, the weather this summer throughout Europe is horrific. An extremely powerful volcanic eruption in April of 1815, an eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, has, over a year after the event, altered weather patterns. So essentially, this is a summer of cold and rain. So these writers, poets, are basically forced to stay inside, and they need to figure out what to do to pass the time. And this is the beginning of the famous ghost story contest, where everyone is asked to write a ghost story. Dr. Polidori writes the first story of a vampire in England. Shelley and Byron both try their hand at Gothic-y poems, but they're unable to complete these. Mary Shelley, of course, begins during this time her famous novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Byron did around this time, however, in July of 1816, write his own poem called Prometheus. And some years later, Percy Shelley wrote a long poem, really a drama, called Prometheus Unbound. So why is Prometheus so important to the Shelleys and to Byron at this time? Well, one reason is during this summer, there's a real sense that the universe itself is going dark, that this is a world of cruelty, of fates, power that humans cannot control, that ultimately we are pawns at the mercy of vast uncontrollable powers. A volcanic eruption can essentially destroy at a second's notice thousands of people and alter weather patterns for months after. There's a sense that there is a sort of dark fate at work in the world, that the world is not as it should be. And one way to struggle with this is to rebel through an act of consciousness or imagination or thinking. The sense is that we as humans, because we are made of matter, ultimately have no agency in some way. We're pushed around just like clouds or rocks or insects. We're no different because we are made of matter and we are controlled by these dark laws. But we also have consciousness, imagination, the ability to think, and this in some ways allows us to transcend the fate and create patterns, forms that give meaning to the dark fate and allow us in some ways to transcend it. Now, let me give you a sense of how this works. Byron, in a drama that we're not reading called Manfred, has his protagonist Manfred say this: "How beautiful is all the visible world, how glorious in its action and itself. But we who name ourselves its sovereigns, we, half dust, half deity, alike unfit to sink or soar, with our mixed essence make a conflict of its elements, and breathe the breath of degradation and of pride, contending with low wants and lofty will, till our mortality predominates. So we are half dust, half deity, alike unfit to sink or soar, and with our mixed essence make a conflict of its elements, and breathe the breath of degradation and of pride, contending with low wants and lofty will. This gets to the core of a conflict in Byron. Byron was brought up at a young age in a very strict religious environment. He was brought up in Scotland with a mother who was very strict with her Protestantism, and he spent time with a nursemaid who was also kind of a religious fanatic. So he grew up believing there's a sense of predestination, almost a puritanical sense that we are controlled by some kind of cosmic will. And Byron retained that belief as he aged, mainly through his reading of history. He was an avid reader of history. He was in particular interested in Napoleon, and he learned from history that indeed men, women have very little agency in this world, that we are pushed around by vast historical forces that have nothing to do with us. So that's one side of Byron's thinking. But also, Byron was a notorious profligate. He was a character. He was flamboyant. He was hyperbolic. He was petulant. He was pouty. He was seductive. He was hypocritical. He was authentic. He was a lover of liberty of any kind. So this is the other side of Byron. So this conflict between being fated and being free. How can he somehow reconcile possibly these two powers in his life? So Prometheus, for Byron and for Mary Shelley and for Percy Shelley too, during this time, was a symbol of a figure controlled by the iron dictates of a tyrannical God, but yet somehow he retained a sense of freedom through his consciousness, through his knowledge. Now, it wasn't only the natural environment that got Byron thinking about dark fate. It was also the political environment of the time. This is the time in England known as the Regency period. So between 1810 and 1820, George III, the king, had gone insane to such an extent that his son was running things. He was the regent, running the kingdom. And he himself was notoriously corrupt. He was a glutton. He was a gambler. He was a womanizer. Gleaned respect really from no one, and he was running a country that at the time had been at war with France for a very long time. Of course, this war ends in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo, but up until that time, Byron and Shelley, Mary Shelley, had grown up during the Napoleonic Wars, and because of this, England was basically a police state. England was terrified of a revolution occurring on its shores in the same way that a revolution occurred in France. So there was no habeas corpus. You could be arrested for no reason, thrown in jail if you were suspected of any hint of treason. There were laws in place that kept people from holding meetings to protest. There were also moments when the government came down hard on those who did try to push against the laws of the time. So the regent and his ministers become stand-ins for Byron of Zeus, the Zeus who is, in the story of Prometheus, a cruel oppressor who does not want humans to enjoy fire. So Prometheus steals fire to give it to humans out of a sense of generosity. So he's a rebel, but he's a rebel with a generous heart. Moreover, Prometheus knows, his name means foreknowledge, he knows that one of Zeus's offspring will overthrow him, just as Zeus overthrew his own father. But Prometheus will not tell him who this offspring will be. And this is ultimately why Zeus changed him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. and by day has vultures come and eat his guts out. By night, Prometheus heals. The same thing happens the next day. So you can see why Prometheus would be a hero to Byron, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley too, but I'm going to focus on Byron for the next few minutes of this talk. As someone who symbolizes this duality between, let's call it fate and freedom. So Prometheus ultimately is a rebel. He works on behalf of empowering humans to live decent lives, to give humans agency. So he is in some ways a reformer, but also he, of course, is punished for this and loses his agency. So how does he retain his sense of freedom? Well, that's what the poem Prometheus is about. It's about how Prometheus is a symbol to us, humans. Why? You are a symbol and a sign to mortals of their fate and force. Like thee, man is in part divine, a troubled stream from a pure source, and man in portions can foresee his own funereal destiny, his wretchedness and his resistance, and his sad unallied existence, to which his spirit may oppose itself, and equal to all woes, and a firm will, and a deep sense, which even in torture can descry its own concentered recompense, triumphant where it dares defy, and making death a victory. So even though we might be shackled by fate, just as Prometheus is shackled to the mountain, we can still defy in our minds and with our will the forces of tyranny. So our consciousness, our ability to choose how we will think, our ability to choose how we will feel, makes us free ultimately no matter what. And we are free to defy our oppressor, not to yield. In this sense, Prometheus, the poem 1816, might remind you of Albert Camus' famous essay on the myth of Sisyphus, in which Camus talks about how absurd life is and how ultimately life has no meaning. And we have to face that. And only when we face that can we actually be happy, because we no longer attempt to transcend this meaningless world or impose illusory meaning on this meaningless world. So Sisyphus, even though he's doomed to push a rock up a hill, watch it roll down, push it back up the hill, watch it roll down for all eternity, has a happiness, Camus suggests, because he is conscious of the fact that his life is absurd. And this knowledge ultimately allows him to know that he can think what he wants, even if his body is controlled to do this repetitive action for all eternity. So you can see why Prometheus would be a hero to Byron. We're not talking about Mary Shelley or Percy Bysshe Shelley now, but they valued the Prometheus character for similar reasons. Prometheus is but one of many characters that, let's call it the second wave of romantics, valued for their status as a rebel. You'll see Satan show up. But more particularly, Byron himself tried to create a persona where he could become a sort of Cain-like transgressor of the laws of the time, or a satanic type transgressor of the laws of the time. So you see a skepticism in Byron that doesn't really show up in the first three poets we've read. His sense that ultimately we cannot be free, that history is messy, meaningless, and we are victims of it. That's the starting point. So how then can one find meaning? How then can one find agency? How then can one create forms that might rise above the rubble and offer meaning and structure and pleasure?